cool. All right, we're just waiting on some people to log on. I'll just give them a few minutes. Okay, a couple more minutes and we get started. All right, I'm back. So let's get started. Hopefully everybody can hear me well. We're just adjusting a couple of things. All right. Okay, hello everybody. Behind me you will see the beautiful city of Melbourne. It is now 7 p.m. For some of you it's first thing in the morning. I'm Eva Hussein, the CEO of Polaron. Welcome. The session today will last for about an hour, but we'll leave the last 15 minutes for questions, and I can hopefully make it quite tailored to your needs. But what we're going to talk about today is where to look for Polish records. And our event today, the webinar, is part of the Family History Month, which is celebrated in Australia quite widely. So let me take you through our agenda. All right. So let me just click on something here. Yeah. Okay, cool. So now you can see me. We will cover a few basic things about what the National Family History Month is, a little bit about our company and what we do. Then we will move on to Polish history, migration waves, and we'll cover a case study so that I can explain to you where to look for records and how to find them. And the last bit of our presentation will be a few shortcuts, tricks, tips, and as I said, the last 15 minutes I shall leave for questions. All right. So it is, the Family History Month is an initiative of the Australasian Federation of Family History Organisations, and it's been going for about 11 years now with around 200 different events. And this year, Polaron is taking part in the initiative for the first time ever. Our company's been around for about 2000, since about 2000, so 17 years. I am its founder and CEO. We are based in Australia, but we do work with many clients globally. Many clients from America, from Canada, South Africa, Israel. Many European clients as well. We do have offices in London, in New York, in Germany, in Lodz, which is the second biggest city in Poland, and of course in Melbourne, and that's where the head office is. So since the beginning of the company, we've confirmed around 7,000 applications for Polish citizenship. Monthly, we do about 50 applications. And we do work very hard at having a good relationship with the Voivodeship Office, which is the processing body for citizenship, as well as various archives, all kinds of institutions in Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and in the countries where our clients come from as well. These are just some pictures of what we look like. And we do get involved in all kinds of initiatives. This is Paula, who manages our office in Poland. That's me, and this is the Polish Festival of Federation Square in Melbourne. That's what the Polish passport looks like, of course. So let's move on, and many of you will be well familiar with Polish history, but I just wanted to cover it briefly so that you can see how over centuries Poland, which is one of the biggest European economies at the moment, has changed, and geopolitically it's located between Germany or Prussia and Russia, and over centuries it's enjoyed a position of power and a position of weakness. So it's a country which is more than 1,000 years old. Here you will see a brief outline. Oops, sorry. Historically, what happened to Poland over the years. So the most interesting period for us is from about 1795. So those of you that are interested in discovering your roots and using that information to confirm your citizenship, it is because at that time Poland has undergone 3 separate partitions, and it was essentially wiped off the map for about 123 years. So it didn't exist until around 1918 and 1919, when during the interwar period the Republic of Poland was re-established, reconstituted. So for 21 years it was free, and I'll show you how the borders changed as well shortly. And of course in 1939 Germany in the west and USSR on the east have invaded Poland, and until 1945 it was partitioned, if you like, once again. It reclaimed its independence in 1945 with brand new borders, and it was communist until 1989. Okay, so this is 992, when Poland was first named Poland, I guess, when it was Christian. So you can see the borders here. That's the Baltic Sea. And these are the borders. The red line are the borders of Poland in 992. Very quickly, the country expanded. So 1125, a much bigger area, again bordering Czech Republic, Hungary, Russia, and the Baltic Sea. This is 1300, when again the borders changed. So this is where we are seeing the changes, and the area of the Baltic Sea has become much smaller. So this is what Poland borders looked like after and during the partition. So you can see how across the years here, and not very long period of time at all, but the areas that are brown went to Russia, so light brown, all of that. Pink to Prussia, so all of that. And green to Austria-Hungarian Empire. And why is it important? It's important because around this time, many of our ancestors, lived in Poland in those days. And when we're looking for documents, if we have to go back to any time prior to 1918, we might need to look in countries other than Poland, and all the documentation that was issued around that time until 1918 may have been in other languages. So, for example, if the family comes from this area, they are likely to be in Russian. If they come from this area, they, on the other hand, likely to be in German. All right, and this is what Poland of today looks like. So the dark brown borders, and this is as opposed to the yellow borders, which were for the interwar period. So after World War II, Poland has gained this area that belonged to Germany prior to the war, but lost all of this area that was part of Poland during the interwar period. So all in all, around 25% of Poland territory was lost to then USSR. The interesting thing was that these borders here went back and forth for quite a bit, as recently as 2000. So when Czechoslovakia split and it became Czech Republic and Slovakia, there were still small but regular movements of borders. So different towns went back and forth, particularly in 1950s. And that's why nowadays it's a little bit difficult to find documents from different areas of Poland. We know that in 1960s, Poland and then USSR have exchanged documentation. So a lot of archival documents were returned to Poland. However, much of it has remained in USSR, or today's Ukraine, or Belarus, or Lithuania, and nobody really knows what happened with a lot of the documentation. And of course, 2004, Poland joined the European Union, and any one of you that has been to Poland prior to that and more recently will know that there are big changes that we are all seeing with the infrastructure, but standard of living and all kinds of things that we are witnessing as we speak. So as far as immigration wave, Poland, people out of Poland immigrated ever since the inception of the country, I think. So since 1300s, people were immigrating to today's Ukraine, but also United Kingdom. The main and the biggest waves of migration happened early in the 1900s. So there was a type of immigration that was called zachlebem in Polish, meaning for bread. So this was born out of poverty. And, around 1900, many people went to Canada and also United States, to the point where today there's something like 9 million people of Polish origins in the United States alone. So those dates that you're seeing here on those maps indicate when people immigrated. Most recently, there have been two large waves of immigrants, so displaced people after the World War II and post-Solidarity immigrants, so after around 1980. And Polish people are everywhere. The darker colours indicate higher concentrations of Poles. And to Australia, people were immigrating as early as 1800s, and most people came here after World War II and also after 1980. Nobody really knows how many people of Polish background there are in Australia, but it is roughly estimated between 60,000 to about 120. So with the shift of borders that I've showed you, it's really quite difficult to estimate where, how people see themselves and where they come from, because if you look at the language that they speak at home, the picture might be different than the place of birth or place of immigration. A lot of people were born after the war in Germany, yet they consider themselves Polish. So, people's identities are a bit fluid sometimes. But you can also see that many people immigrated to South America. Quite a large concentration of Polish immigrants in Argentina and Chile and a few other places. Okay, so moving on, we're going to do the case study. And the reason I wanted to do that is because people that registered for the webinar, when we asked them what is it that they want us to talk about, most indicated that they would like to know how to look for records. And I wish I had a magic wand and could say to you, go to that website, click that button, and everything will come up. Unfortunately, that is not possible for a number of reasons. One is that everyone's ancestral story is different, and that's what makes our work very interesting and your journey very interesting. But depending on where impalant people come from, when they were born, when they married, where they lived, what work they did, how and when they departed Poland, depending on all of that, the search for records will be different. So Jan Kowalski, a typical Polish name, he was born in 1912 in Radom, and you could perhaps compare that to your own ancestral history, but I'll take you on a journey of this particular person so that you can see what commonalities there are and perhaps what you can learn from his journey, even though he doesn't really exist. So born 1912 in Radom, which is central Poland, and by 1919, Jan Kowalski was at primary school. So regardless of where people in Poland came from, education was always very important. So most people went to school, even if it was a couple of grades, you know. It wasn't really compulsory, and particularly for kids that were from farming family, after 2 or 3 classes or 3 grades, they had to just simply go and help the family out, so they had to drop out of school. So 7 classes or 7 grades was mostly what people did. So, and so did Jan Kowalski. So by 1926, he finished his schooling, and he started working as a shoemaker in 1927. In those days, people married really young, so by the age of 20 or 22, they would not only be married, particularly women, but perhaps had 1 or 2 children. And this was indeed the case with Jan Kowalski, who at the age of 20 in 1932 married. I hope we've got all the numbers here correctly. But, by 1935, so at the age of 23, Jan Kowalski had his first child. Well, not him, but his wife, Rosalia. And as the war was brewing, in 1938, he was put in the reserves. He was conscripted into the army. And 1st of September 1939, first day of war, he was captured by the Germans. Very common story for relatively young men who fought for freedom of Poland. We know that a lot of soldiers were captured at that time. So they were captured and kept as prisoners of wars in camps in relatively reasonable conditions, I guess. But around 1941, 1942, depending on which regions, they were released to work in farms mostly. It was compulsory to work there. It wasn't that they were free to go, but a lot of them were given work to do in whatever capacity they could. And many people, many soldiers like that survived the war, and when the war ended, they were released and became displaced people. Now, you might ask what happened to his wife and children. Well, as far as Jan Kowalski was concerned, they died during the war. He never did find out what happened to his family. Come 1945, he received a message that his wife and child were killed. So he did marry again in 1946 and decided to immigrate to Australia. Many of these people became displaced because the areas that they came from were no longer Poland, or they were worried about the fact that Poland was communist, and or they did see it as an opportunity to immigrate. And many of them immigrated to Australia, to America, South America, and many other places. So that's a typical story of someone who left Poland during the war. Another typical story of people that left Poland before the war would have been that they just didn't end up in the camps. They simply immigrated on Polish passports. But what happened to Jan and many, so we're talking about hundreds, if not millions of people, were that they ended up in Poland without any documents necessarily, in Germany without any documents necessarily. And they were put under the care of the International Refugee Organization, who essentially facilitated immigration for them. Some of them were taken care of by the International Red Cross, but certainly to Australia and many other countries, there was a program of getting able-bodied, hard-working young men into Australia. So in Jan's case, he was given an opportunity to come to Australia, and he came here on a temporary visa with his new wife, and he was required to work for 2 years on some sort of a government program. Mostly it was labouring somewhere. After that, they were able to apply to stay in Australia. And many other countries had also had programs like that for the displaced people. We did mention briefly documents earlier, so I wanted to show you a couple of examples now in the context of what I've talked about and how the borders changed. So the entire area that was once Russia, so we're talking about prior to 1918, documents in those areas were issued in the Russian language. So when we find documents, you won't be able to see it clearly, but don't worry. This is written in such a difficult to follow handwriting that you do need experts. So we're looking at a birth certificate here that is handwritten in Russian. So in those days, the registry officers had books into which births, marriages and deaths were written. So it's a, very laboured and neat handwriting, which is nowadays quite difficult to read. So whenever you apply for a birth certificate prior to 1918 from an area that may have belonged to Russia, to Russian Empire earlier than that, it's most likely going to be in Russian. So the archives will transcribe it for you, but only the basics. So there are people who painstakingly are able to read these records because they do contain a lot more information than your standard birth certificate. They might have an address, they might have information about what profession people did, what time somebody was born, who the witnesses were, and lots of other interesting things, such as whether the parents were married or not. And so this is a copy of just part of a page from a book that was kept in those days. This one here is written in Polish, again in the interwar period, and it's an extract. So in other words, somebody that worked at the civil registry was in charge of issuing certificates. So rather than taking copies of a book, which they were not able to do because there was no photocopies in those days, there was a form that they would fill in and stamp, confirming, these were handwritten, as you can see, confirming that somebody was born on such and such day. What I should tell you, and many of you that are interested in family history know, is that many of those records have a lot of errors, and they include discrepancies in names. So that is because if you think about a document from a book of births that's written in Russia, and then it gets transcribed into Polish, there'll be discrepancies because this is written in a different system, in Cyrillic, and Polish alphabet's got letters that don't exist in Russian. So in other words, between those two documents, there'll be quite a few discrepancies. And also people use different calendars. So, Russian Orthodox or Greek Orthodox would use a different calendar. Jewish people use a different calendar. So often births were not registered immediately after a person was born. It was done whenever somebody remembered and they thought, okay, well, yes, he was born 5 days before Christmas or whatever it was, and then they would quickly run up to the registry office and write it into the book. At the same time, the child might have already been going to school, and so there are many people that don't know actually when exactly they were born. So many of those documents were sort of written on somebody's say-so. This is another birth certificate. It's for someone born in 1906, but created in 1951, so already typed and a bit neater in its appearance, as you can see. These are school certificates. Again, these are quite rare documents that were issued by schools. Records from schools are quite difficult to source in Poland, but I just wanted to show them to you because in your own records you might have them. So that one and that one is a school certificate. The middle document is, on the other hand, a birth certificate. This is from the Polish archives. You can see that it's stamped with a Polish flag. These records are available online, and these are written in a very difficult to read Polish. So it's a very labored old script, and on the basis of that, you can get a birth certificate issued that's transcribed. But again, these original books and records contain a lot of useful information in relation to people's marriage, or what time they were born, who the witnesses were, where they lived, who the siblings were, quite possibly, but they're not easy to read. That's another certificate that's in Russian, in Cyrillic. That's a school certificate. So you can see that each document that we're looking at, it looks slightly differently. And again, that's a work certificate, that's a handwritten work certificate, that's a marriage certificate. And all of those will also vary depending on a person's religion. So for Jewish people, the ketubas or the marriage certificates would look quite different than the church ones. And then, so in other words, what I'm trying to show you here is that there's no easy way of, there are no templates, because each of these documents looks different, and it really just depends of where in Poland the family comes from, and what language they were issued in, and what religion the family was, etc. So what we're going to move on to now is where to look for records, and I'll start with Australia, because Australia's got one of the most comprehensive and amazingly organized archives, and those of you that haven't used it, I would strongly encourage you to. So I'll show you what it looks like and what you can find. Sorry, I'll just bring that here. Okay, so this is the website of the National Archives of Australia. It contains a lot of information and a lot of documents, but when you're looking for your family records, you will be able to find two types of folios here. One type of folio would be your immigration files, so anything that was created by the Australian government prior to your family coming to Australia, and then naturalisation files, so not just the naturalisation certificate, but any information that the Australian government was able to collect on you, on your ancestors when they were applying for naturalisation. And these resources are very rich information because they were created back when people were being accepted into the immigration program, or prior to being naturalised. So I will show you. So just in here, in the collection, although you can choose a few different ones, which I'll show you later, you can just type in the name, and I've chosen one that's quite easy to remember. And these records are publicly available, so we're not breaching anyone's confidentiality. But what I wanted to show you is what amazing papers and documentation you can find here. So for this particular person, Hirsch Lederman, you can see that he is Polish, right? He does say here that he's renouncing his nationality and allegiance. I will explain to you how that may or may not affect your Polish citizenship, if that's what you want to pursue later. But let's just look at some of the interesting things here. So you can see that Hirsch has adopted a name of Harry. Which is really interesting because many people did, and not just in Australia, but you know, there was a bit of pressure always to adopt a name that's easier to pronounce or you know, adopt. What else do we have here for Harry? Okay, we've got his address and also who lived with him, I think. So that's his entire household. We know how tall he was, 6 feet and 2 inches. Okay, so he was born in Warsaw in 1901, 25th of August. And he does talk about his nationality being Polish. His father was Russian and his name was Benjamin. Now we also have his date of arrival, 4th of October 1927, and also how he came, on what vessel and where from directly. His spouse is also mentioned here. Is there anything else we can learn about his family? Apart from the very interesting things about his health, there's also a mention of change of name, and those that want to pursue Polish citizenship will know that Polish government finds it really strange that you can change your name without any paperwork. So that's considered paperwork. That's official. Hirsch became Harry. Okay, is there anything else that's of interest to us? No. But I will show you something else that let me just move on to the next one. Okay. So what you can find is people's photos, and for a lot of our clients, it's the first time they've seen a person's photo. You can see somebody's handwriting, and that tells you a lot about a person because, you know, that's a very labored hand signature, and that may indicate that the person wasn't necessarily literate. And here you can see his fingerprints, which is interesting as well. Let me just see. I was going to show you a Polish passport. Okay, Benjamin Labe. Let me have a look. No. Because Polish passports were kept by the Australian archives. I'll show you naturalization files dating 19. Okay, there may be a passport here. Fischl Lederman. Not in this instance, but yeah, that's it. They'll have a Polish passport, I think. Yes. So Shlomo Lederman came here on a Polish passport that does say dowód osobisty, which means identity card. But the National Archives of Australia hold this document, which was issued in Warsaw. Let me just see if I can enlarge it a bit and show you a bit more about this man. So yes, not just born, but resident of Warsaw. What else does it say? So it's got all the, unfortunately this bit is, there must have been some sort of a stamp, because that talks about his profession and other things, which I cannot quite see. But what all of that means is that if your family came here before 1939, after 1918, before 1939, it's very likely that their passport may well be with the archives. So it's really worth checking. And if your family came here after that, so you'll see all kinds of visas, all kinds of very interesting stamps, and that can tell you where the family's been and how they came to be in Australia. So if you're one of the lucky few whose family came here before 1939, and that's true particularly for Jewish people, their passports might be there. Okay, so that's that's National Archives of Australia. A very, very rich resource. We're very lucky in Australia to have it. Websites such as Ancestry.com or findmypast.com.au are commercial websites that may or may not have information on your family. I will skip them, but you can register. They do have 14-day free trials, and you can have a go. They're not very good at finding information in Poland, but they will contain data on your ancestors, particularly in America. Things like birth and marriage certificates, etc. Speaking of which, if you go to the Deaths and Marriages website, this one is Victorian. Depending on the year that we talking about, you might be able to find documentation here. Okay, and each state in Australia will have a separate registry. So some of this information, of course, is protected by privacy laws, but you can contact them, and for documentation that's older and for people that are no longer deceased, you might be able to get it. In the United States, there are other websites which are also commercial that you can find information in. I wanted to show you Genealogy Index, because that's one good resource of looking for information, and it's free to use. So let's have a look at Mr. Lederman, Shlomo. Let's have a look. Okay, so there are some tricks in how to look for information here, and that includes putting things in inverted commas so that it's easier to find and point to the right place. So we don't know whether that's Shlomo or not, but let's say he comes from Częstochowa, which he doesn't because he came from Warsaw. Oh yeah, we can do that as well. We can say Warsaw in Polish. Okay, so it's quite possible that oh no, he's already left, so we cannot find him here, but perhaps his cousin had let's see what he had. That'll take a few minutes to open. Okay, so what we're looking at is business registry for Lublin voivodeship. So currently there are 16 voivodeships in Poland. There were more prior to the war and also 45 after the war, but recently voivodeships have been consolidated into 16. So the thing with those resources is that you'll get a scan of the document, but it's not searchable. So we would have to look very hard here to find Mr. Lederman, and I cannot see him immediately. But if I spend a few minutes looking through all the names, I probably would. So that will give you an idea of what work he did. So these are names of places, and then each place has got a list of professions. So for example, this is a midwife, pharmacy, etc. So it's really quite hard to see. So if you're very patient and have a bit of time, you can most certainly have access to those and just spend a bit of time looking, which I would encourage you to do. It also has, this particular database has things like banking records, business records, all kinds of things that might be of interest to you. And as you can see, you can you can choose dates, and you can also choose different areas of Poland if you know where your family comes from. All right, so I would encourage you to spend a bit of time looking through there. All right. Now, for those of you whose families were displaced during the war, and don't worry, we will be sending you this PowerPoint presentation so you can click on the links and oh, I don't know what is happening, but something is happening, so I will. Okay, yeah, that's opening it now. Hold on, let me just bring it. Okay. So this particular database connects to the Red Cross's international database of displaced people in Germany, in Bad Arolsen. And it is a bit clunky to use, but if I was to look for Mr. Lederman from place of birth Warsaw, even though he's left Poland well before the war. So this would only be useful for people that have stayed in Poland, basically. We can look at, let's have a look at somebody who, Israel Lederman, let's say. So what do we know? We know that he was born in 1939 and died in 1939 in the Warsaw Ghetto. And he died of food poisoning, and that is his address, Gensha 85. And it also tells us the source of this document, which is the Jewish Historical Institute. If I was to type in Kowalski here, given that it's the most popular surname in Poland, one of the most popular, let's see what we get. Okay. So we have Mr. Jan Kowalski, who was born in Warsaw in 1920. And here we see his father's name, his mother's name, and also somebody's reported his death because he died in 2007. But let's see what we can learn about Mr. Kowalski. Okay, quite a lot actually. we know that he survived the war, that he worked as a slave laborer in a place called Barsbeck in Germany. And he was taken to Germany in March of 1943, released in May when the war ended. And this organization has got those records. So again, a really interesting source of information. Not everyone's here, and sometimes names will be misspelled, and with popular names you have to put a few qualifiers there to be able to find anything. But if you do, then that's again, that's a very rich place of where the information is held. This one, that's playing up again. Let me see if that opens. Okay, this particular database concerns people that were subject to oppression by the Soviets. So those that were pushed, the other way. So if I was to look for Lettermans, let me have a look. Okay, so there are quite a few, and again, quite a lot of information. So this information is in Polish, so might not be that easier for you to follow, but reading between the lines, we know, well, not just between the lines, but Abram Lederman was born in 1918. His father's name was Feivel, and he was arrested in 1940 in Belarus, so what is now Belarus. And NKWD has got information on him, and this is the file number. And the few times that we can actually find here, and the records are really fragmented, they're very accurate. So again, if you know that your family during the war were pushed towards the east, it's quite possible that that information might be here. The other good place to look for things is Polish National Archives, or Szukaj w Archiwach. Once it opens, I'll show you what it looks like. And again, that's a very rich resource, and it is in English. It's a little bit clunky in that various things are stored in different sections of the archives. But let's have a look from Mr. Lederman and see what we can find. So what you get is unfortunately in Poland. So again, in Polish, sorry. So again, you'd have to painstakingly look at each name and see if there's anything there that would be useful. But you can see the years which these various documents were created. And that's just a general search, which would require you to look at, everything. Hopefully your name is not as common as Lederman or Kowalski. So the Polish National Archives also have residential records, and we're talking about a lot of records that are quite fragmented. As soon as it opens, I will show it to you. Yeah. So let's say we say Radom, and that will tell us, hopefully, what residential records they have. Okay, and this requires for you to have at least basic Polish or use Google Translate or whatever it is. But there are lots of records available online, as you can see. The next one would be vital records. So anything that's over 100 years old in Poland goes into the archives, and it's available for you to look at with some exceptions. So this particular one, let's go Radom again. will tell you what records they have. So not specific records, but what books and for what periods of time they might have. And you can see here that it's divided into religions. So, for example, that's Jewish, that's evangelical, and that says whether they marriage or birth certificates, etc. But they do have very comprehensive records here, as you can see. Okay, so this is a register of vital records, which is divided into voivodeships. So the 16 that I was telling you about, as well as Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine. And here, when you click on the section of the map, you can give it a go. At times, you can find things, but most likely you don't. Okay, so just to warn you. And they mostly have Catholic, we're assuming that Mr. Lederman's probably Jewish. So if we try Mr. Kowalski, we should have a bit more luck, but also a lot more records. Okay, so these are death certificates. Okay, let's try maybe Jan. Okay, and here that says scan. So this is a death certificate of Jan Kowalski, and these are copies of the actual books. And this is written in Latin, in a very difficult script to read. So let's have a look at some newer documents, perhaps. 1900. Okay, so again, Latin. Let me just see where Jan Kowalski is. Okay. Somewhere here, I think. No, can't find it. So sometimes this point not quite to the right page, so you have to keep looking. And this is a birth certificate. Let's have a quick look at a birth certificate. This one will be from 1711. So that's in Latin. Yeah, and the quality of the book, as you can see, is a bit poor. But if we try and find something from more recent times, hopefully we can read it a bit better. Okay, let's have a look at it. Okay, so Latin, this is the birth certificate of Jan Kowalski, except that they've translated his name into Latin and he's Johannes. But from this you can see that his father's name was Elias and mother was Rosalia, and a lot more other information if you can read Latin. So if you do know the area that your family comes from, again, painstakingly, you should be able to find something. Okay, we're kind of nearing the end of our time together, but I wanted to show you a couple of really good archives in United Kingdom. One of them is the Sikorski Museum. It's an amazing resource. They do hold records of the Polish government in exile, and some of the resources of various consulates and embassies. And they do have an online resource which I will show you as soon as this opens. And also British National Archives are pretty well organized. You can't find things easily online as you can in Australia, but they do have immigration and naturalization files there too. Okay, so I'll show you now. As soon as the Tchaikovsky Institute opens. It's also worth visiting it if you're ever in London. They have 5 floors of an amazing museum, and they do run tours, and it's a very interesting place to visit. So whilst that's opening, Belarus, Lithuania, Ukraine, the links will be in the email that we'll send you. I should tell you, though, that you do need to write to them in Russian, and several times. Writing to them once may not be enough, and it has to be a letter, although in the more recent times they've started replying by email. And the thing with Belarus, Lithuania, Ukraine is that they really do have very comprehensive and very well-preserved records. It's just hard to get them out. Okay, so I'll just bring here to you the Tchaikovsky Institute and Museum. And here you will be able to see what documents they have. And again, some of them are digitalized, but most are not. So, you know, really well-preserved, comprehensive documents. So if your ancestors were in the Polish army, or particularly in the Air Force, that information might be here, so worth following it up with them. So as we're nearing towards the end of our chat this evening, a few tips. People that come to us for help with the research often don't even know their grandparents or great-grandparents' names. So we start with the archival documentation that we can get our hands on, because this documentation was created and it's fresh. And often discrepancies in names, things that were heard and written, we have to pore over those records and try and work out what the name actually was. But often John or Ben was Jan, Yannick, Johan, or even Giovanni. We've seen it all. So whenever you use any of the resources that are online that we're about to send you when the session is finished, please try varieties of spelling. And this is particularly true for people with Jewish ancestry, because at birth, kids were often given a Yiddish or Hebrew name, and then in more assimilated families in particular, they would adopt a Polish name, and then they go to America and they have yet another name. So you have to try everything you can think of. And same with the surnames, particularly in families that were not super literate. People didn't know how to spell their names, so whatever was heard by the person that was creating a document was written down. And lots of discrepancies in dates of birth and ages. We have discovered through our work many people that were bigamists, so married, you know, Julian Kowalski, who knows whether his wife was actually deceased or not. So a lot of marriages were invalid because people just assumed that their spouses have died. And even if you find records of siblings or cousins or grandparents, you know, like that paints a really good picture. And once you start putting the family tree together, it all starts making sense. So looking at other records, not just directly related to your ancestor, is sometimes helpful as well. With nationality, we've already looked at some of the records in Australia. people's nationalities were not always what they considered themselves to be. So use caution. Sometimes people had to declare themselves Ukrainian to be able to immigrate, and yet they may have considered themselves really Polish. And this is because the borders were shifting, and people just needed to get out. We've also put there on the screen that sometimes nationalities was self-reported and not always clear. So different documents may list people under different nationalities. So sometimes it's Polish, other times Russian, Ukrainian, German, even I've seen it. And dates we've already covered. And because of the partitions, there will be documents that you will come across that are written in Cyrillic Russian, sometimes Yiddish or Hebrew, other times in German, and all languages in between. So if you want more information about anything I've said, this is our email address. I have terribly run out of time. I've totally underestimated how long this is going to take to cover everything. But if there's anything in particular you want to know, feel free to email, and we will provide you with the PowerPoint. If you click on the links that are included in it, you'll be able to go to the websites that I showed you. And unless you want to engage a professional researcher, it's really up to you how much you can find out about your Polish ancestors. A lot of it is being curious and patient and determined, but we are yet to find a family where records do not exist. So if any of you are struggling finding information or documents on your family, it's probably because we either looking at the wrong name, wrong place, wrong date. So you have to be a little bit creative and open-minded, but I would be more than delighted to answer any questions you might have, so feel free to email. If you have any questions now and you're not in a hurry to run off, feel free to ask them now. Let's have a look. All right, so the question is, how do you look for Jewish records in Poland, given that a lot of documentation has been destroyed and lots of synagogues are no longer there? Yes, it's true. What you can find on people of Jewish heritage in Poland is quite limited. But again, I would start with any secondary archive. So if your family's immigrated to America, that's where I would start. Some of the Polish consulates might have records on your family as well. And also things like letters, backs of photos. Sometimes there are annotations there. Anything that, a little box that somebody's left behind. Notes on margins of books, see if you can find any of that. For Jewish people as well, going to the cemetery is a good idea, because often on people's graves, the Yiddish names or the Hebrew names are written. So again, if you're looking for Max Lederman, you're not going to find a birth certificate for him because his real name was probably Moses or something like that. Okay, let me, and yeah, I should also add that some Jewish records do exist. It just depends where your family comes from and how far you have to go back. So anything under 100 years old, so anyone that was born or married or died after 1917, their records would be at the civil registry. Everybody else's would be in the archive. So anything that's over 100 years old gets transferred across. Okay, the next question is, how difficult is it to find things in the Ukrainian archives? Very. Okay, and you do need to write to them in Russian and keep following up. Some of the links that I've included on our presentation will take you to the archives there. More than happy to share more information with you. Okay, the next question is, let me just read that. Yes, how does all this relate to citizenship? But we won't have we won't have enough time. Maybe given the popularity of today's sessions, we had more than 60 people. Maybe we should run a session that's more specific to that. But basically, what you're looking for if you do want to pursue your Polish citizenship is records of your ancestor living in Poland. So either a residential address or a passport like we've seen, or any other document that would indicate that they were resident of Poland after 1920. And the reason I mentioned 1920 is because that is when the first act on Polish citizenship was introduced. And I'll be more than happy to cover eligibility and everything else at another session. Okay, let me see if there are any other questions. Yes, one more. About Polish politics. No, we won't go into that. Yes, there's lots of noise, let's put it that way. But I think Poland's doing really well economically, and politics we shall stay out of. So thank you, everyone. Any questions whatsoever, please email, and you will receive this presentation that I've just covered, as well as a little booklet. I think it's got about 30 or 40 pages of where to look for information and how to go about it. Other than that, thank you, everyone, for attending, and I hope you did find it useful. Any feedback, let us know. Okay, thanks a lot. See ya. All right.